Hey, welcome back everyone. It's been quite a week since my last video. I've gotten phone calls, private messages, people reaching out to me who've been hurt by the church. If you're wondering if this episode is for you or if you should watch to the end, if you have ever been hurt by the church, seen other people hurt by the church, are in the church and see things that aren't right and wonder if you should stay, or are wondering if you should go back, then this is for you. And this isn't going to be like anything you've probably ever heard before. And we all need to hear it. So I'm going to take you back to the Old Testament. And the reason for that is because history is something that we should be aware of so that we can learn from it. You've probably been told, as I've been told, and probably have told other people, that the church is the apple of God's eye. It's the place to be. If you're going to be faithful, you should stay there at all costs for whatever reason. Don't let anyone's else's behavior knock you out of the church, etc., etc. In some cases, that's true. In some cases, that's not only not true, it's not even possible. So the reason for that, if you ever wonder why, we talked about it a bit last episode, but didn't get real deep into it. If you ever wonder why the church can be such a mess, it's because if you were the devil, where would you spend most of your time, energy, and effort? He hates God. If the church is the apple of God's eye, then he hates the church and he'll do anything to destroy it because it's the place where God should be lifted up, where hope should be lifted up, and oftentimes is lifted up. And if he can distort it, twist it, he wins. Or at least he wins some of the battles along the way. Ultimately, we know that God will win. But whether or not we're a casualty in the war or victorious depends on how we relate to our own journey. And that's where it gets messy. So, the story I want to take you back to today is the story of David and King Saul. So, for the sake of applying it to our own situation, King Saul represents the highest leadership of God's people. And he went bad. We know he went bad. So, what that means is you could be in the right church and still be under leadership that has gone bad. That's a fact. David was faithfully following God in his own life and was rising and rising to the point that he was clearly seen by everyone to be the next in line after King Saul. And that fact alone drove Saul even further down his path of self destruction. Here's the thing David ended up outside not only of King Saul's inner circle, not only did he end up outside of, well, let me be frank, he ended up living with the enemy. So I want to take you to the first major step on that path. It's a few verses in the Old Testament that you may not have ever been familiar with. You might even have read them, but you know how it is when we get reading the Bible, when we have a goal to read 2 chapters or 5 chapters, and at the end of it, we don't even remember what we read. Here it is. So David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Why is he escaping? Because he's being hunted by the leadership of the church. I will tell you honestly and frankly, I have colleagues whom I love and respect who are currently outside of the church looking in, who've been run out of the church by people who should have been loving them, supporting them, working with them instead of working against them. That's a fact. I have been maligned myself. I have seen others be maligned, even fired, for no good reason and no righteous reason. David is departing and escaping from the leadership of the church. He had to leave. So this is 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 1. So David departed from there and escaped into the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's household heard of it, they went down there to him. So there were good people inside who loved him, and they pursued him. If you are in the church, and you see things go down that shouldn't go down, and people being treated like they shouldn't be treated, it is your privilege and your responsibility to pursue the people who've been wronged and to love them. Verse 2. Everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became captain over them. Now there were about 400 men with him. This is the beginning of David's kingship. He is the captain of the people in distress, the people in debt, and the malcontents. Listen to how it reads in the Message. Now, the Message Bible is not a direct translation. Instead, the Message Bible tries to take the essence of the meaning of the text and put it into common language. So David got away, and he escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and others associated with his family heard where he was, they came down and joined him. Not only that, but all who were down on their luck came around, losers and vagrants and misfits of all sorts. David became their leader. There were about 400 in all. Before we go any further in David's story, I want you to consider Jesus and the disciples that he chose himself. They were, by the standards of the Jewish nation of the day, misfits. They were. Fishermen, you don't call fishermen. That they're not at the right level. And I could go on. Simon the Zealot, a political wingnut. Matthew the tax collector, working on behalf of the Roman Empire. Misfits. Every single one of them. Misfits, but by whose standard? So that was 1 Samuel 22. We're back in David's story. So if you flip to chapter 27, this should blow your mind. Then David said to himself, "Now I will perish one day by the hand of Saul. If I stay with the remnant, if I stay with the king, if I stay in the church, if I stand with the nation, I'm going to end up dead. There is nothing better for me than to escape into the land of the Philistines." Philistines, remember David and Goliath? Goliath was a Philistine. "Saul then will despair of hunting for me any more in all the territory of Israel, and I will escape from his hand." So David arose and crossed over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish the son of Maoch, king of Gath. And David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, each with his household, even David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelite and Abigail the Carmelitess, Nabal's widow. Now it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, so he no longer searched for him. We could spend a long time unpacking that, who those 2 wives were, their backgrounds. This is a ragtag bunch of people. And they have found no place for them anymore inside the very people that God raised up through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses. This nation of Israel is the culmination of some of God's promises. Jesus is the culmination of all God's promises. But David finds no place for himself, even though he loves God, has been faithfully serving God, has only ever done, give or take, for the most part, at this point in his life, what God has wanted him to do. Yet finds himself so maligned by King Saul that there is no place for him. Not only in Saul's entourage, but in the nation at all. Not even in some far-flung village. He has to leave and live with the enemies of Israel. If that doesn't blow your mind, I don't know what will. You say, well, what does that mean for me? What it means is your number one responsibility is to pursue God, to be faithful to God. A few years back, I blog. I blog every day. So if you're on Facebook and you want to follow my blog, it's posted on Facebook every day. Feel free to message me and request my friendship on Facebook, and I'll get you connected. So a few years back, I blogged through books of the Bible, and I finished a book, and I put it out on Facebook to see what book we should do next. And one of my former students, I used to teach Bible to grade 11 and 12 in Nova Scotia, Sandy Lake Academy. One of them wrote to me and said, would you do a series on the women of the Bible? And in my head, I'm like, well, I don't really do that. That's not really my thing. I just kind of go through the scriptures verse by verse. But the idea wouldn't go. I couldn't dismiss it. So I messaged her back and I said, which women of the Bible were you thinking? And I figured she'd message back and say, like Mary and, the big names, Sarah, Rebecca. She messaged me back a long list. I was like, this girl's serious. So I started blogging through the women of the Bible, starting with Eve. Ended up cooperating with a former church member of mine from Nova Scotia. She did some amazing, fictional, non-fictional, first person. Anyway, it was pretty neat. Then our church locally here got the opportunity to get some airtime on the Christian radio station. And for a year and a half now, we've been having episodes every Sunday evening on the women of the Bible. And the reason I'm telling you this is because your job is to press in and stay close to Jesus. And that happens by the simple little decisions you make every day. Am I going to talk to God today, or am I going to get too busy today? Am I going to spend some time in His Word today, or am I going to be too busy today? Am I going to choose the content that I consume based on what's going to bring me closer to God, or am I just going to do what I want to do? So if you're looking for quality content, I can recommend to you people who aren't me. But if you don't know that I have other content and you want to consume it or look into it, www.freshangle.ca will take you to our radio program website, where you can see all of our archived, or listen to all of our archived episodes. Again, I'm on Facebook, so if you want to see my blog. So I blog every day. I have a weekly radio episode on the women of the Bible, and I do this channel primarily to reach out to people who are struggling with their faith, who maybe aren't even in church, probably aren't in church anymore, but God is still pulling at your heartstrings. God is still after you. He's pursuing you. And in the journey of doing that, we've come to this place where there are people who are on the outside, not because they want to be on the outside, but because they've been driven out. Pastors who've been driven out. Employees of the church driven out. Regular church members who ask questions that people weren't comfortable with, driven out. People who've been abused and tried to find justice, driven out. People who look at the way we treat the status of women and say, that's not how I think it should be, driven out. All kinds of reasons people have found themselves on the outside looking in. And I wanted to do this episode to show you that if you're on the outside looking in, you're not alone. David had to leave the nation entirely with a band of misfits and live in the land of the enemy for his life to be safe. Jesus was pushed out of Jerusalem, spent most of his ministry in the far-flung corners of Israel and much of it beyond the borders of Israel because it wasn't safe. And history has shown there have been many times where the church has been so infected and infested by those who are closer to the devil than they are to God, that the church became more of a hindrance than a help. I don't know your personal situation. I know that God is going to save his people. But I no longer believe that that means that there's a group of people inside a defined space with a name and an identity, and those are the saved people, and everybody else is lost. Because if Jesus had returned in 1 Samuel 27 to end the world and to bring his children home, the king of God's people would have been left behind. And David and a band of misfits living in the land of the enemy would have been taken home. Your responsibility is to love God and love your neighbor. And if you are in the church, you know it's not perfect. That doesn't mean you should leave, but it does give you the responsibility to reach out to those who, for whatever reasons, have been run out, pushed out, kicked out, or just maligned to the point they couldn't handle it anymore, and love them. Sit with them. Listen to them. Walk with them. I would rather be on the outside and faithful than be more devoted to the unfaithful leaders that rise up from time to time than I am to the God who made me. One of the phone calls I got last week, someone asked me, like, aren't you afraid making these videos that you're going to get run out? Personally, I don't think so. In the context that I currently work, we have amazing leadership. I love them. I respect them. I think they're godly people. But I'm not going to not do or do what I do based on any of that. I'm sitting here investing my time right now because God loves you. And God wants you to know that wherever you need to be for your own personal well-being, mental health, and safety, he sees you, he hears you, and he's coming for you to bring you home. God bless.